Hello everyone, this is Professor Zach Dog, and I'm here for a video I've really wanted to make for quite a long time. Specifically, a kind of a surface level dive into the pre-Columbian history of the Americas. This is a topic I'm actually quite passionate about, which might be surprising given how I look, but I owe a lot of that passion to a specific set of books by Charles C Mann. Specifically, the book 1491 and its sequel 1493. Both books about the pre-Columbian American society. 1491 focusing more on before, 1493 more on the impact of the Columbian Exchange. Much of this video is a summary in part of those books and parts I find the most interesting. And if you end up liking this video, I implore you, please buy these, please read them. I cannot recommend them enough. If you did click on this video, I also hope you're at least a little bit interested in the topic because I'm not an animator. I am working on a budget of $0. So I hope that the sparse visuals I've made and my sparkling personality are good enough to keep you watching. Anyways, I think it's time to start actually talking history. The first topic is actually more of a question. How many people lived in the Americas before the Columbian Exchange? This is a question with many moving parts, and also one that's subject to many opinions, and I intend to give mine. It is very much connected to everything else we're going to discuss in this video, and estimates range wildly from only a few million all the way up to 100 million people. I would personally guess somewhere in the range of 60 million people, but the estimate comes with a series of assumptions. The darkest, but also the most important assumption anyone has to make when assuming a rough estimate of the population of the Americas is the mortality rate of the various European plagues. These plagues ravaged the Americas in ways that are nearly unthinkable to someone living today. And to make my 60 million assumption requires a very high mortality rate. Easily 6 out of 7 or even 7 out of 8 people alive dead from one of the plagues. This is more plausible than you may assume, as the plagues did not hit like one giant explosion of death, but more like repeated waves of destruction, one after the other after the other. And most places decimated by this had never personally even had contact with any of the Europeans. But wave after wave, smallpox, malaria, influenza, typhus, so on, hit towns and villages until many were simply uninhabitable. The effect this would have on a civilization is hard to even imagine. The toll that having 85% of a city's population die within 10 to 30 years is more than nearly any society can survive, and this was true in the Americas. Supply chains dissolved, forcing starvation, and empires large enough to have more advanced and intricate economies, such as the Incan Empire, those economies collapsed. Carefully maintained roads all through the Andes simply lost the supply chain needed to keep them up and running and well maintained. And this kind of thing happened all over the Americas. The general conclusion many historians now reach is that much of the Americas were empty because the epidemics temporarily collapsed the ability of many of those living there to maintain their existing way of life. Imagine for a moment if something similar happened now, in a modern society with all of our safety nets. Could any country on Earth today survive without 80% of its population? Honestly, this alone would have cleared the way for a European conquest, which certainly did not help the native population recover, even ignoring the technological advantage. We will discuss disease again a bit later, specifically malaria, but for now, let's move on to another topic. Something I think hopefully a little bit less dark. A history of some of the empires that existed when the Europeans first came knocking. Let's take a look at a map of the Americas in 1491. or our best estimate of it. As previously mentioned, the continent was ravaged by disease, leading to society collapse before many places could be mapped. So, a lot of these borders are quite inaccurate and, frankly, just guesses. For now, let's discuss two of the most famous empires at the time, the Triple Alliance and the, Tawantinsuyu, or as they were better known, the Aztec and Incan empires. I'm going to use the easier to pronounce names for my own sanity, but the ones I used before would be the more accurate terminology, so just keep that in mind. I'm not going to focus too much on the specific details of the conquest of these empires. That's been done to death. But I'd like to talk more about how they were right before their fall and how this influenced their fall. Let's start with the Triple Alliance, which was, in fact, an alliance between three city-states, and a very new power when Spain first came down to Mexico. It was actually a pretty complicated system of tribute. While Tenochtitlan, I'm sorry, I am terrible with these pronunciations, was the strongest of the three city-states. It was in charge of controlling the military and, as such, received the largest share of the tribute from their variety of vassals. It was by no means a supermajority. All three of the city-states in the Triple Alliance played important parts in governance and administration. The below map shows the extent of their control, but this is a kind of misleading way of displaying their conquest. The Aztec did not often directly conquer, and importantly, directly control many of the places they conquered. It was more of a kind of unique take on feudalism, leaving regions kind of, mostly under their control after conquest, but still full of lots of dissent and disloyalty. The Aztecs were also a very new power, upsetting the existing balance the region had had. Their alliance was founded in only 1428, and within 100 years, they had reshaped Central America, but once again, not quite as firmly as you may believe. Many hostile and neutral societies lay unconquered within their borders. The ruling and administration of this empire was very unique, especially because of the three cities which formed its core. However, much of the territory ran on a system of tribute. This made turning on the Aztecs, who offered little protection, always tempting, and the empire was permanently walking a tightrope. If their military dominance was not absolute, it would, and did, all collapse very fast. This weakness was exploited by Cortez, who brought it down. Cortez was able to ally with the Aztec enemies, both internal and external. The largest Spanish ally, the Tlaxcala, were inside the Aztec Empire, but not actually a part of it. As a side note, in a very rare scenario within history, the Tlaxcala were actually mostly spared by the Spanish thanks to their aid in bringing down the Aztecs. While they were eventually conquered, they were largely granted a privileged status and allowed to maintain their cultural identity even over time, marking a rare long-term collaboration between a native civilization and a European colonial power. Back on topic, despite the way it's often depicted, the Spanish siege and conquest of the Aztec Empire was not some miracle victory stolen out of nowhere, allowing the Spanish to bring down the Aztecs. Frankly, the Aztec Empire was almost guaranteed to fall as soon as Europeans first set foot in Mexico. Smallpox alone would have caused enough dissent and sabotage to disintegrate the narrow hold the Aztecs had over Mexico. And despite all this, it still took the Spanish a couple of expeditions to fully subdue and conquer the peninsula. On the topic of actual miraculous victories, let's discuss the other massive empire, the Incan Empire. The Incan Empire have a surprisingly difficult history to map for two main reasons. First was the Spanish destruction of Incan history after they conquered them. This was, unfortunately, fairly standard Spanish practice to really try and adapt whatever the native societies were to their culture and Christianize them. However, the second reason was the Incan destruction of their own predecessors' history after they came to power. I have to admit, there is some irony there. Regardless, we believe the Incan Empire was founded around 1285, and they also began a slower, more methodical conquest of the Andes. As I alluded to, the Incans were not the first to do so, and there is strong evidence to suggest at least one or more sizable empires in the Andes before the Incas. That being said, the Incans did do it best and created the largest Andean empire that we know of. Their conquests in Peru were finished actually right before the Spanish arrived. Ironically, the conquest of these northern tribes was made easier because these tribes were ravaged by smallpox. However, the tidal wave of disease did end up hitting the Incan Empire as well, leading to what may be the fastest collapse of a frankly pretty stable empire due to a series of civil wars and intervention by Spanish conquistadors. Again, aided by disgruntled people who were recently conquered by the Incans. Side note, the Incans did actually somewhat survive, and there was a short Neo-Incan state kind of back in the heart of the empire that resisted the Spanish through guerrilla warfare for about another 30 years, so they were then eventually vassalized and then annexed by Spain. Unlike the Aztec, the Incans were not quite as doomed to fail. Although disease would have certainly threatened to end the empire on its own, the Incans were one of the only empires in the Americas with somewhat of a disaster failsafe. They had a robust transportation system that would survive on its own even without maintenance, at least for a little while, and even extra grain reserves, ideally for droughts and stuff of that nature, but it certainly came in handy when the empire was battling waves and waves of plagues. With no Spanish intervention, the Incans would have probably been crippled by the disease and lose a sizable chunk of their most recent conquests, shrinking back down to their core territory, but they may have survived. However, the Spanish arrived at a moment of weakness for the Incans, and their empire was already the most overextended it had ever been, even without a wave of plagues washing over it. I mentioned previously that the Incans destroyed as much evidence of previous empires as possible, but we do know of a few smaller but longer lived than the Incas, specifically the Wari and the Tiwanaku. Both fell at similar times due to, at least the best guess, a combination of natural disasters and war, allowing the rising Timor to take over. We don't know a lot about these cultures, although what we do know is really quite fascinating. For example, the Tiwanaku capital appears to have been a kind of symbolic city, meant to be flaunted and visited, but doesn't actually function as a city on its own. It was an ancient tourist trap, which is apparently also a modern tourist trap, because tour guides down there like to just lie about the ancient ruins, and tourists just eat that up, apparently. It was a pretty fascinating place. Charles Mann describes it as somewhat of a combination between the Vatican and Disney World. So, really, really unique. Both cultures eventually fell to the Timor, who did what they could to hide evidence that either existed. And then the Timor fell to the Incas, who didn't have time to fully erase evidence of the Timor, but were working on it. The history of the Andes is mysterious as it is deep, but it has some of the strongest and best preserved ruins in the Americas, hence why we know so much. There seems to be evidence of a series of civilizations that are at a variety of organization and centralization, from the earliest known Kotosh civilization to the Chauvin, which are the first civilization we know traded and conquered with other societies, who were then succeeded by the Mochi, which directly predated the dual empires of the Wari and the Tiwanaku, who were then succeeded by the Timor, and then eventually the Incans. If I'm not careful, I'm going to spend the entire video talking about all the different cultures in this area that were predated or conquered by the Incas, but suffice to say, this was a very wealthy and very powerful area with a very rich history. It's not really accurate to talk about GDP, especially when you're talking about ancient empires. What we do know is that in terms of just the raw ability to produce goods, the Incans probably rivaled Portugal or England, who was having a bit of a rough time right before the diseases and the Spanish hit. I mean, I seriously love studying this region, but I'm not going to talk about it for the whole video. So for now, let's move on and discuss something a little bit more abstract. Strangely, what I want to talk about now is credibility. My credibility of Charles C. Mann, and most importantly, the credibility of the few primary sources we have for what life was like before and right after the Columbian Exchange. Charles talks a great deal about the recorded adventures of one of the earliest explorers of the Amazon River. These fantastical accounts describe cities of gold ruled entirely by naked women, massive empires, perilous enemies. Of course, the archaeological record does not support these findings, and any modern-day historian can obviously see that this is mostly fabricated. But what I think is more important is to ask why it was fabricated. While many Western accounts do have a tinge of propaganda about dealing with the savages of the New World, being an explorer or conquistador was also about personal glory and career growth. A glorious expedition could bring you prestige, but also land you a position as a colonial governor, something that happened to both Columbus and Cortez. It was the Spanish policy at the time for conquistadors who conquered a region to be made the governor of that region. For this reason, all accounts must be looked at with a significant deal of skepticism. Not trust but verify and then verify again. That's not to say these accounts are useless, but compared to the archaeological record, they are unreliable. Finding reliable sources is very difficult for cultures without long written histories. And most of the things we know, and even many of the things I've already said, aren't actually known for certain. Obviously, this means we have to trust the native accounts instead, right? Well, it gets a little complicated. Compared to Europe, tradition and history was mostly passed orally rather than the written word in much of the New World, which means that a lot of this was lost when societies fell apart from the waves and waves of disease hit the region. Honestly, we're probably talking Library of Alexandria levels of like history and at least oral tradition lost from that event. We really don't know how much we don't know. Then again, back to the Incans, we also know that a lot of these societies were not immune to propaganda or changing history to support whatever the current ruling class is. So it's not like you can really take all of this at face value, even though it's not coming from the Europeans' accounts. Anyway, the credibility discussion was actually pretty important because my next topic is pretty controversial, and a lot of respected historians disagree on this. I would like to take some time to discuss how the various peoples of the Americas treated the environment. Now, I was raised with the luxury to visit a lot of the pristine American wilderness, and that's made me a little bit of an environmentalist. But strangely, this is where many modern-day environmentalists actually clash with native groups. Again, when I was young, it was hammered into me that the natives preserved the natural environment exactly as it was, with no waste, a stark contrast to the rampant deforestation and pollution of modern-day society. Now, this is not completely wrong, but a more accurate description would be to say that the natives maintained an environment most suited for them. Let's start with something safe and proven that everyone can agree on: the domestication of maize and corn. As you may know, maize and corn looked way different before its domestication, and over the years, various tribes of people specifically bred more and more edible versions, till eventually we ended up with the modern day corn that we all know and love or tolerate or hate. This was not that uncommon, but it's also, if you're being technical, not leaving the environment as you found it. Maize was just a grass, and we modified it, cultivated it, turned it into a crop. If we can all agree there, let's jump ahead to something a little bit more controversial: the Great Plains. While these plains are often associated with the untamed wilderness of the Americas, many people assert actually kind of the opposite. As you may know, the natives were experts in slash and burn agriculture, something they often used to regulate and control the forests. There is strong evidence that the Great Plains were artificially expanded, burning away vast swaths of forest, preventing tree growth, in essence, growing great fields for the American buffalo to expand and graze and grow and be hunted. Somewhat ironically, from what we know, the American bison was at its highest peak population of all time shortly before we drove it nearly to extinction because of this somewhat artificial expansion of its grazing grounds. These and many other examples paint a picture not of natives simply living in harmony with whatever they were given, but shaping nature when needed, literally managing it, protecting it when needing it, and changing it when the time came. Now, they aren't perfect at this, no one is, and archaeological evidence actually shows that a pretty large city once existed in the Mississippi Valley. You may have heard of this. A city with great mounds. Now, this society fell before the Europeans arrived, but why is actually not a mystery. From what we can tell from the archaeological record, there was massive deforestation and the redirection of a local river right through the city for what we assume are religious reasons, or possibly prestige regions. After this, the city was beset by flooding until eventually it all fell apart and became uninhabitable, scattering the people off into smaller societies. Mann himself asserts in his book, 1491, that the natives were more or less environmental engineers. And this is where there's a kind of funny ripple effect into the modern day. Many modern environmental groups actually find themselves in conflict with natives groups, as a lot of native groups want to manage the environment as they have in their past, keeping on their traditional ways of hunting and managing the forest, where environmental groups want to preserve it exactly as it's seen now. That topic is a whole rabbit hole and could do its own video, and I'm not going to be taking a stance there. That's too controversial for me, but it is a fascinating modern consequence left over from ancient times. Now, let's move on and discuss North America and disease at the same time. Even before the Columbian Exchange, North America was less populated than Central and South America. Compared to Central and South America, North America was actually probably on a population decline when the Europeans arrived. Complex side effect of the Little Ice Age, a whole lot going into that, and it's just a guess. That being said, it was not some untamed wilderness, and at least a big chunk of the population was not nomadic, at least not yet. The coasts in particular were fairly densely populated, but the diseases hit them often before the Europeans even got a strong foothold in North America. So we don't have a lot of info about what it was like in this section of the world. We do know that when the English started scouting for their first and ultimately failed settlements, they recorded a coast brimming with fires, strongly implying a huge presence all along the coast. Now, once again, this could have been, European propaganda, it could have been a scare tactic by the natives, or simply coincided with the slash and burn cycle that the natives used at the time. But it is safe to assume that when the English first landed and settled, there was a lot more natives there than when they returned years later. Subsequent voyages reported pristine, empty wilderness, coastlines empty and clear. Once again, how much is propaganda? Hard to say. Disease took a huge toll on the native populations. However, one disease in particular really shaped this continent in the long run: malaria. Malaria was quite unique in that it was an equal opportunity killer. While it ravaged native populations, it also killed a huge number of Anglo settlers. Like a really huge number. Survival rates for the early colonists were under 10% for nearly 100 years. However, unlike the natives, there was a steady supply of eager colonists that kept coming year after year after year from Europe. Malaria was also a huge factor in how slavery shaped the Americas. Some may wonder why the Europeans shipped over so many slaves from Africa, despite the fact that people already lived in the Americas. The answer is that the Europeans did enslave the natives. This hurt the native tribes in more ways than one. Obviously, being enslaved, not good for anyone. But the people selling the European slaves were often other native tribes, often in exchange for European steel and weapons. This literally caused an arms race, as more and more tribes fought each other for the sole purpose of capturing slaves to sell to the Europeans, so they could get enough weapons to prevent being enslaved themselves. Obviously, this practice ended eventually for a couple reasons. One, increasing triangle trade made the importation of African slaves only a little bit more expensive than indentured servants or native slaves. But two, and much more, arguably more importantly, is malaria. Malaria killed both the natives and the Europeans very, very effectively. But due to some genetic reasons, many Africans were actually pretty resistant to the disease, specifically Africans from the Ivory Coast. Because of this, European settlers started importing slaves from Africa at a much higher rate, as they would survive longer and didn't know the terrain like the native slaves did, making it a lot less risky for slave owners if they tried to escape. I'm not going to say that malaria caused slavery, but it did accelerate it, and is part of the reason for the geographic divide in the states. In the colonies where malaria was a problem, the South, the Caribbean, etc., they imported African slaves at a much higher rate than the northern states, where malaria was not nearly as big of a problem. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the Iroquois. I would love to pronounce their accurate name, because I would also prefer to use their accurate name, but I tried pronouncing this like 5 times and gave up. I don't want to do it a disservice, so I'm going to stick to Iroquois from now on. The Iroquois were one of the larger North American societies at the time that the Europeans came, and had a pretty unique system of government, in a way similar to the Triple Alliance, in that it was an alliance of tribes. While they had previously been in conflict with each other, they came together, formed a larger alliance, and stayed a pretty large factor at the time that the Europeans were getting settled, and lasted through the waves of disease. That being said, it's a bit hard to find out when they specifically formed. Our best guess is that the alliance was formalized in 1450, although tradition, or at least Iroquois tradition, claims that it was founded in 1142. The Iroquois were a very fascinating and very egalitarian society. They had such notions of liberty, according to the British, that they banished all servitude from their territories. It is the British, but still, they were a fairly egalitarian society, and interestingly, they even added new tribes to their original 5-tribe alliance. Despite their egalitarian nature, They still, at least previously, had a somewhat expansionist culture and conquered areas to enable them to support a larger population. They were also actually pretty adept at dealing with the Europeans when they landed in the Americas. They made alliances with the Europeans when they could, and lasted a lot longer than a lot of the other Native American tribes, at least up in New York in the essentially the prime of the European settlements. Anyway, I really do want to go on, but I promised myself this would be a somewhat short video, so I am going to stop it here. But believe me, there is a lot more that could be discussed. And if you like this video, I'm begging you, please at least go buy the book 1491. It's an incredible and entertaining read. Let me know if you'd like more like this. I wasn't really planning on making more videos like this one, but if somehow this blows up and everybody loves it, finds it fascinating, I would be very happy to make more like it. A lot of work went into it, but it was a lot of fun work because there's nothing I love more than researching something I already love to research. So, once again, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.